The UK government has unveiled a huge batch of changes to the asylum system. There's a lot in there, but the big one is it will make it much harder for people who come to the UK as refugees to stay in the country permanently. What's changing, why, and what could the consequences be, both practically and politically? We will unpack all of it on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And we'll be here for a mere 27-ish minutes, which seems very fleeting.
Yeah.
So, Chris, we had quite a lot of build-up to Shabana Mahmood's big unveiling of the changes to the asylum system that the government would like to introduce. She obviously sat down with Laura on Sunday, and Laura and Paddy and Henry talked about a lot of the politics around it. But today we actually saw the detail in black and white of what the government wants to do, and this came with a big parliamentary moment as well from the Home Secretary.
It did. 88 questions, the team told me she took in the House of Commons. Eventually got to her feet at about 5:45 because, as you say, there was various things going on prior to that, and left the chamber about 8:15. And then started doing interviews with the likes of me and Robert Peston of ITV and Beth Rigby of Sky and others at about 9 o'clock, which is a joy when you're making a piece for the 10 o'clock news. But it was all fine. I mean, I think what's interesting here is that they've really, in the Home Office, seems to me the Home Office are always in the news, either inadvertently or advertently. And for the last few days, it has been advertent. They have been seeking to make headlines and seeking to dominate the kind of political conversation pretty much since Friday. And there was a bit actually even before that. And then, as you say, she was talking to Laura at the weekend, and then all of the stuff in the Commons, and then talking to a load of political editors on Monday evening. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they know there are kind of two pillars of issues, if you like, that'll be the biggest determinants of whether this government can haul itself off the canvas in terms of popularity. And they're massive. One is the economy, the sluggish economy. And, you know, there'll be plenty of chat about that in the next week with the budget coming up. And then the second one is migration, both legal migration and then illegal migration, and in particular, small boats. Can they demonstrate some sort of grip on this issue? Now, Shabana Mahmood talks in very blunt terms and talks about her team, about how she's a minister in a hurry. And so we've had this blitz of stuff in terms of what she's done in the last few days, and then setting out these ideas in the House of Commons on Monday to try and set up a series of new policies that she hopes will demonstrate grip. Because she was saying to me that, in her view, I asked her what the most egregious example of the failure in the system was, and she said the whole thing. None of it works. It's all a failure. So that's her kind of analysis and diagnosis. But, you know, for this government overall, the time is kind of running down on being able to blame systems that you've inherited. And actually, they need to demonstrate grip of systems that they now control, which is what she hopes to be able to do.
And there was a lot going on in this proposal. It's 30 pages from the Home Office. It's a combination of things that can be done without legislation. Quite a few things, though, do need new laws to be passed. Some of it will then trickle down to be guidance for judges when they look at individual cases. But also, before we dive into the details, we should maybe just give a bit of context here. So this is mainly about people entering the asylum system. Yeah. And if you're then granted asylum, you become a refugee, and which is a special status in the immigration system. And this year there have been 111,800 people have claimed asylum, and 39% of them were in small boats crossing the channel, and around about the same number, slightly less, 37%, arrived by legal means. In other words, came here on a visitor's visa or a student visa and then applied for asylum, having entered the country through a sort of regular means.
Exactly that. So the small boats are often the most visible and therefore big P political issue around the whole question of asylum. But as you say they're about 4 in 10 of the applications. A significant chunk, in fact, a broadly similar chunk in proportionate terms, are the much less, if you like, visible in each individual instance. Example of people who've arrived legally through one means or another and then have applied for asylum at the end of their visa, and the government clearly keen to be seen to squeeze both elements of those numbers.
And also, the vast majority of people who apply for asylum are actually granted it.
Yes,
the system deems them to be allowed to stay here.
Exactly that, and therefore you get all sorts of questions asked, almost irrespective of an individual's view or instincts on the overall asylum system. About right, okay, so at what point are things not working here, and what might be seen to be pull factors? At the same time, where should the country demonstrate what would some see as compassion? Which elements can be tweaked? What is fair? Can it be or should it be retrospective? The government says no, but then how quickly can they change the law so that it can visibly, if you like, and politically make a difference? What do they do around the European Convention on Human Rights? You'll have seen that the Conservatives and Reform advocate leaving that convention entirely, that the government says no. They think they can sort of clip the wings of it rather than shooting it out of the sky. They want to change the law around Article 8, which is the right to a family life, and then talk to other European signatories to the ECHR around the whole question of Article 3 around inhuman and degrading treatment. But that might take time. It will take time. And, that alongside loads of other elements that we can dive into, and you may have heard the Weekend Gang talking about on Newscast, at the heart of what the Home Secretary sees as having to look at every single aspect of the asylum system and basically rewrite it.
Right, we're getting into the details now. And so to get a bit more insight on that, I called up Dr. Madeleine Sumption from the Oxford Migration Observatory, and we went through what Shabana Mahmood had proposed to MPs today in a bit more detail. Madeleine, hello.
Hello.
And welcome back to Newscast.
Thanks for having me.
First is a question of scale before we get into the details. I mean, the government is presenting this as a really big change. Is it a really big change?
I think it is a really big change, yes. It would make the package of support that's offered to asylum seekers and the conditions that are offered to asylum seekers who are successful in their claims the most restrictive in Europe, I think. And it's pretty different from the status quo. Now, obviously, this comes on the back of a few years where we had some other really big changes. So I think if you compare it to the Illegal Migration Act, which was introduced under the Tories and then scrapped by this government, the Illegal Migration Act was probably more radical in the sense that it swept away the entire system, right? It's to effectively abolish the asylum system for large groups of people using it. So it is arguably less radical than that, but I think it is probably, I think what the government is probably trying to do is effectively go as far as they can go while remaining compliant with the Refugee Convention and with the European Convention on Human Rights.
And another philosophical question before we get into the practicalities. Do you think this is as much about creating a deterrent and so making the asylum system seem less attractive to people as it is about actually implementing a new asylum system?
Oh, I think it's very much about creating a deterrent, and that's, I think, largely how it's been framed. The challenge that the government faces is that on the one hand, it wants to say, we're upholding our obligations under international law, we comply with the Refugee Convention and with human rights rules, but they don't actually they want to then prevent people or deter people from coming and actually then accessing those protections. And so effectively what they're trying to do is to undermine the UK. The UK has this reputation of being a welcoming and tolerant place, and that's one reason that asylum seekers come here. And so they're engaged in what some analysts call negative nation branding, which is what Denmark has done as well. It's effectively trying to create this image of not being a welcoming place so that fewer people will come here. But it's very difficult to do that in practice. And so it's quite difficult to predict what the impact of these measures will be and whether, in fact, a really significant deterrent will materialise or not.
Well, let's delve into some of the details now. And I suppose everyone is still processing what this is all going to mean. And of course, it will be introduced bit by bit because some of it's legislation, some of it's regulations, some of it will take a while for the system to get in place. So it's not a sort of big bang thing that happens all in one go. But the big thing the government is touting today is this idea that refugee status becomes a temporary thing, or at least a thing that has to be renewed every 30 months for people when they come here. Just explain what you think is going on there.
Yes, this is one of the areas where it will be interesting to see precisely how it's implemented, because you could imagine if they were actually trying to effectively remake an asylum decision every 2.5 years in order to make sure that someone's still qualified, it could be an absolute bureaucratic nightmare, right? They've already got a backlog of asylum claims. I very much doubt they would want to then, effectively sort of keep on adding to that backlog by reassessing everyone. So we'll see how they plan to implement it, but it seems likely that they will go for something a little more light touch, where maybe they target specific groups of people who come from a country where there's a known change. The regime has changed. For example, Syria, over the last few years, people came. If they were given refugee status on the basis that they were being persecuted by the Assad regime, then perhaps they would no longer qualify. So that's the idea, is that would then be reassessed over quite a long period, over up to 20 years. Although there may be cases where people then can switch into a different route if they're working or studying. The details of all of that are not really laid out in the white paper, so we will await further information about, how easy actually will it be for people to switch into this new sort of work and study status if they're doing one of those activities.
And the 20-year thing is important, because at the moment you can get granted refugee status in the UK, and once you've been here for 5 years, you're entitled to apply for indefinite leave to remain, which is almost like British citizenship. It's not, but it's permanent status to stay in the UK. So this would be extending that from 5 years of residence to 20, so quadrupling.
That's right, yeah. And depending then on what the criteria are for people to switch out of that 20-year protection route into a shorter route, it could be that quite a lot of people are affected by that and do end up on the 20-year route. We know, for example, that the employment rates of refugees tend to be quite low. Many of them struggle in the labour market. So it's possible that that we'll see quite a lot of people doing the full 20 years. It's also possible that, some people will be able to switch out of that if they're working or studying, especially if the government decides to have less stringent criteria on that route than would be required for people coming in on a skilled work visa or a standard international study visa.
And what do we know about this ability that people will have to switch from the sort of the core protection status that the government's now calling this into the work and study status, which comes with different terms and conditions? Because I thought there were really strict rules on what refugees could actually do in the workforce.
Well, once someone has been granted refugee status, then there are not strict rules. They're allowed to work in any job. And,
this is the classic thing of like when you can just get a bit tangled, because actually it's only asylum seekers who are still in the process waiting for a decision that aren't allowed to work.
That's right. Yeah. So most asylum seekers wouldn't be able to work. There are some people who have work rights. If, for example, if they came on a work visa and then they apply for asylum, and actually the government is saying that there will be an expectation that those people will work and that that they want them to work in order to support themselves. So the main issue then, once people get onto refugee status, everyone is allowed to work, but their employment rates do tend to be quite low, especially initially. It takes quite a long time for them to settle in enough in order for most of them to be able to work. So that is the point at which then people might be able to switch into a work-related route if they're working, but we don't know any detail yet on what that work-related route is going to look like.
Yeah, and of course, once you're in the work-related route, it then looks like you'll be able to get indefinite leave to remain to stay in the UK permanently quicker than if you were just in the core protection refugee route, which is the 20 years.
That's right. And the government is separately reviewing all of those policies on how people will be able to qualify for that permanent status, regardless of whether they're a refugee or not. And so I suspect that, they may decide to align some of the criteria with, what other migrants in the system will be required to meet. But we'll have to see the detail.
And then we get on to supports, both financial and accommodation. There's a few things here. What do we know about changes to what benefits and help refugees will be able to receive from the state, and how that will be judged whether they get any help or not?
Right. So this, again, is an area where it's not totally clear precisely what they're going to do. But there are two basic stages. You've got the stage where someone is still in the asylum system, so they don't have a decision yet. And they're saying that they want to restrict the circumstances under which people will get support. So being put into asylum accommodation, which often is currently hotels, but they're saying that they're going to be moving people out of hotels and into other forms of accommodation. But they want to reduce the number of people getting accommodation at all, for example, in cases where it's someone who has the right to work. We've then got, the next stage, if people are granted refugee status, there's then going to be a review of precisely what they're eligible for in that period. But the white paper doesn't actually tell us exactly how that's going to work. That's an area where further detail will be laid out. So it's unclear currently whether it will continue to be the case that someone who's granted refugee status would be immediately eligible, for example, for universal credit, or whether there will be further conditions or restrictions imposed. We'll have to find out exactly what they're planning there.
And also the government and ministers in interviews have talked about this idea that if you're a refugee and you make yourself homeless, in other words, by not complying with the terms that mean you get a home, at the moment, the state is still obliged to house you. Whereas a British citizen, if they made themselves intentionally homeless, the local authorities' requirements to house them disappears. So Shabana Mahmood, in interviews on Sunday, was saying that they're going to equalise that, so that if a refugee makes themselves intentionally homeless, their rights to housing disappear.
That's right, except that they're talking about asylum seekers rather than refugees in this case. So this is the asylum support system before someone's been recognised as a refugee. They may be a refugee, they may not be, but they're still, that decision is still being made. So if people are in their asylum accommodation, the government wants to make it easier to evict them from the asylum accommodation under certain circumstances, for example, if they committed a crime. Then the people, after they get refugee status, they would presumably have, we'll see exactly what the process is. Do they still have access to the mainstream universal credit regime? Is that slightly different? But that we don't have so much detail on what happens once they're recognised as a refugee.
The other bit where it's quite vague, this document, is the copying the Danish so-called jewellery law, which the British version would be taking into account the resources that an asylum seeker has when they arrive and working out how much help they should get as a result of what resources they've got. That also seems quite vague in there. There isn't a very specific plan for how that's going to work.
No, there's basically one sentence that says that if there are assets that someone has that they haven't declared that are discovered further down the line, then they could be taken into account when if in potentially denying people asylum support. But we don't have a great sense of how that's going to work. If you look at the Danish example, that everyone knows about the Danish jewellery law, this idea that people could have their jewellery confiscated or seized if they show up as an asylum seeker. It doesn't actually look like they've applied it to many people. It's one of these interesting areas where it seems more about sort of an attempt to create an overall image of being harsh on asylum seekers rather than something that's actually happening every day as people claim asylum.
And then there's a bit in the document that sounds very tough when it comes to deporting people whose claims have failed but who have children. And it sounds like the government wants to send a very different message about how much they're worried about that kind of morally and ethically. It sounds like they're trying to flick a switch and send the message that if you've got children at the moment, you can kind of stay, even if your claim's been refused. They want to switch that and do a 180 on that.
That's right. And the immigration system does treat children quite differently in a number of ways. We'll see exactly again what this looks like. I think in returns there are lots of things that happen that on paper happen, can happen that don't happen in practice. The government, has struggled, as this document recognises, has struggled for a long time with returns. The process of it sounds sort of neat and tidy. The actual process of forcing people onto planes or trying to get them to cooperate with their removal so that they will not be forced onto planes. It is a much more difficult process than it sounds when you just talk in the abstract about, ensuring that people are removed.
And yeah, I've just found the sentence or the paragraph that made me say that it seemed like the government kind of changing its mind quite a lot here. Because on this, the paragraph about family removals, it says, we do not currently prioritise the return of families. As a result, many families of failed asylum seekers continue to live in this country, receiving free accommodation and financial support for years on end. Our hesitancy around returning families creates particularly perverse incentives. So that's what I was getting at when I said it seems like quite a big kind of mind switch from the government. So just wanted to read that out so people could understand what I was getting at. And then they also say, they talk about these Albanian families whose asylum claims have been rejected, yet their removal is not currently being enforced by the Home Office, which makes you realise, yeah, it's tools that are available now, but the system has to sort of have a mindset shift to actually use the tools. Right, then the other big thing, and again, we need to just see how this is going to work out, is the reforms around how the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act is implemented and interpreted both by the system and by the judges who then make decisions on individual cases. What's your take on just what's going to change there?
This is another one where it's really difficult to predict in advance what kind of impact it will have, if any. And there have been debates over a number of years about trying to rein in judges and sort of restrict the circumstances under which they would require people to be granted status as a result of their family life in the UK. So it sounds like we're looking at new legislation coming in that tries to further restrict that. But we won't really know what the impacts of that are, I think, until it's been implemented, and to see how judges respond and how they interpret the new language.
Yeah, and it's like when you read the document, it's interesting seeing just intellectually how the government is explaining this. So, for example, with Article 8, so that's your right to family life, they're saying we will pass legislation and then make sure everyone in the system knows that you are allowed to balance an individual's right to a family life, so a failed asylum seeker, their right to family life, with the human rights of everyone else in Britain wanting the system to work and for crime to be prevented and everyone to be kept safe. And so it sounds like sort of pushing down the individual right a little bit and pushing up the public interest bit higher up.
Yeah, that's right. And it's the reason that it's difficult to predict the impact of this is that at the end of the day, the legislation just has words in it, right? So we've got these words, insurmountable obstacles to, integration in the country of origin might be a reason for people not being able to be removed. But then the judge has to decide, well, what is an insurmountable obstacle, right? So all of these are sort of qualitative ideas. And it's very hard for them, you can't put a thing in saying, well, 95% of people should be removed, right? It has to be something that you can apply case by case, which is why I think it's such a difficult thing to, it's very difficult to draft legislation that will do precisely what the government wants, but we'll see what the impact is.
And this is where it gets really nerdy and starts turning into a seminar. But Article 8, right to family life, that is a right that is qualified. In other words, it can be balanced up against other people's rights. Whereas Article 3, which is freedom from torture and inhumane treatment, is like a definitive absolute right. There's no kind of, let's balance this off against other things. You are just protected from that, full stop.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, interesting. There's less room for manoeuvre on 3 than there is for 8.
Yeah.
Also, this idea of returns hubs. So basically, people who have failed in their asylum case and taking them to a third country where they can be taken to, as opposed to returning them to their home country where they can't legally be taken. What do we think the government's saying about that today?
Well, today it said relatively little. It just says we are in negotiations with a number of countries. This is something, I think that the theory behind it is that if people have been refused asylum and they've exhausted all of their appeals rights, but it's very difficult to remove them to their country of origin for one reason or another, if they then go to some other place, possibly some Eastern European destination, Kosovo has been discussed, Albania comes up in the discussion. If they are sent to some other place that is a less appealing destination from them, then from there they may become more willing to go back to their country of origin. In practice, there aren't many examples of these, and so it's quite difficult to know exactly how it would work. I think the typical questions that would come up is, okay, well, what kind of capacity is there going to be in these unspecified countries that we're going to do deals with? How many people might go there? How long would they stay there? Is it true that they'll be more willing to go back to their country of origin from a non-EU Eastern European country than the UK? So it will be interesting to see, well, if that ever happens, because these are things are not particularly easy to negotiate diplomatically. And if it does happen, what kind of numbers are we talking about? Is it a sort of symbolic process where maybe a few hundred people are sent to return hubs, or is this actually something that affects the core of the UK's immigration system?
Madeleine, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
So that's the small print from Dr. Madeleine Sumption. Chris, in terms of the actual measures, I mean, which ones do you want to pick out to elaborate on?
So I think the whole question of refugee status and reviewing that every couple of years, and this idea that you'd need to be resident for 20 years before a refugee can apply for permanent residence or indefinite leave to remain, that is big. That's a massive change from where we are right now, and raises questions about, is this the kind of thing a government needs to do to radically shift perceptions, both domestically, politically, but also amongst people who might contemplate, for instance, a small boat crossing. And then you get an argument that is made from an alternative perspective that says that will make an argument along the lines of, look, there might be two things you really need to think about when you're thinking about immigration. One might be numbers, the others might be integration, and the extent to which you are, as some critics see it, the Liberal Democrats and others, creating a lack of incentive to integrate if the prospect is that you have to go through a process lasting a couple of decades before you can be certain that you are able to stay. All of these questions very, 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 very live. And then from the government's perspective, Adam, there's the whole question of, can they persuade their own MPs of all of this? This stuff is not an easy sell for many in the Labour Party. I was talking to a cabinet minister the other day who said to me, I'll read the quote, "The party membership has no feel or interest in border security," was what they were saying. Now, the party membership is not the same as MPs, and plenty of MPs absolutely do get that this stuff matters to one heck of a lot of people, and they have to demonstrate a grip. But at the same time, even here on sort of day one, if this is day one, it's probably day 4 or 5 of this story, but on the big day in the Commons on Monday evening, around about 20 Labour MPs have so far publicly said that they're uncomfortable with all of this. Now, that doesn't necessarily equate to opposing it when it comes to any votes next year, but it gives you some sense of the concern. The concern that there is on Labour's backbenches and the persuasion that the Home Secretary has to do. And in fact, when I was talking to her, it took I had to push her a little bit for her to express a optimism that that she can persuade her colleagues. So really? She did say yes in the end, but not instantly.
And also, I suppose, because Kemi Badenoch has said the Conservatives will do what they can to help these measures go through, even though they would go much further if they were in government. The size of the rebellion you would need on the Labour benches to derail this, as a result, would have to be huge.
That's true. I mean, oppositions often like to look like they're willing to help. Knowing that the very prospect of a government having to rely...
is actually better than helping.
Yeah, exactly. When a government has to rely on historically its biggest rival in politics in order to get its own legislative programme through, you are in a dire place as a government, even if numerically you could kind of do it. Now, I'm getting way ahead of myself here because there's no indication yet that the numbers would be that tight for the government. And the Conservatives, it's interesting hearing their response, and indeed Reform UK's response, which was to be pretty positive, really, about the sense of direction and about the language and intent of the Home Secretary. And there's a lot of respect for the Home Secretary kind of across the political aisle. At the same time, Labour's opponents know that by flattering her as they see it, and Reform was saying, when are you going to come and join us? You're saying our kind of stuff. And she said, over my dead body, or words to that effect. They know in saying that they are, if you like, jabbing the funny bone of those Labour MPs who really don't find this comfortable and don't think it's the sort of thing a Labour Home Secretary should be saying.
And talking of Parliament, there was quite a dramatic moment during the statement when Shabana Mahmood talked about racist abuse she has received, and which earned her a rebuke from the Speaker because of the language she used. But we'll let newscasters hear it for themselves, but we have bleeped out the particular word that she used because it is very offensive.
I wish I had the privilege of walking around this country and not seeing the division that the issue of migration and asylum system is creating across this country. Unlike him, unfortunately, I am the one that is regularly called a and told to go back home. It is I who knows through my personal experience and that of my constituents just how divisive the issue of asylum has become in our country.
Yeah, quite a moment that in the House of Commons. I mean, the House of Commons has all sorts of rules around language, but you hearing that language anywhere in any context, in the UK in 2025 would instantly sort of turn heads and people would be taken aback by, I would have thought, and many obviously deeply offended by. But she's trying to reflect her own personal experience. And I think, her own heritage, her own constituency, and then her own politics are a fascinating combination, I think, in prosecuting this argument, because this argument made by others would be, I think, a harder argument to make. And she is able to lean into the authenticity of her view, but also the reality, if you like, of her background, her heritage, and her own experience, and this kind of thing that she's had to deal with. To take on arguments, if you like, those who are sceptical in terms of those who think she's sort of going too far, and then others who might think she's not going far enough, or what she plans to deliver she won't be able to deliver. So interesting that she chose again to raise that personal experience and this time do it on the floor of the House. I think there was broadly similar language that she used at the Labour Party conference a few months ago.
And as discussed earlier on in the podcast, there's so many elements to this programme, as in the programme that Shabana Mahmood has just set out, not this programme we're making, that this will all come into force in different bits with different votes on different things over a number of years.
Indeed so. Yeah, it will. And as I say, some subject to international negotiation, an element of the proposed tweak to the ECHR. But yeah, that which requires primary legislation, in other words, sort of starting from scratch, isn't likely to come, I think, prior to the next King's Speech, the next state opening of Parliament, which will be into next year. So this is going to take a while, and few would be surprised by that because of the complexity and the nature of the challenge that they're taking on. And we should remember that the whole question around asylum seekers and the politics thereof have ebbed and flowed in and out of our politics for the last 30 years at least. And now there's a particular issue right now around small boats, not least because, as we've talked about on Newscast, it tends to crystallise a sense of governments, because it has been governments, transparently not being in control of the UK's border, which seems, a fairly central function of the state. So I think that enhances the political salience of it. But yeah, it is going to take time, and the government kind of knows that even if it can keep plenty on its own side, they need to demonstrate grip. They need to see those numbers coming down. They need to see those fewer of those hotels being used, etc., because it's one of those two central pillars that they think, over and above pretty much anything else, are going to have such a role in determining people's ultimate verdict in their competence, frankly.
Right, Chris, good to catch up. See you again soon.
Take care. Cheers, mate.